Thank you very much, Father Dragos, for inviting me. It's a very large question, and I think I'll be veering away from the subject of liturgical theology a little bit, which I hope won't disappoint people. But rather than talk about the problem which so many people are discussing in relation to this crisis, that is our attendance in church and participation in the Eucharistic rite, which of course does have precedents and some answers in the Patristic and Byzantine periods, I would rather look at two topics on which our holy tradition also provides guidance. And these are, firstly, the patristic understanding that God created humanity according to his image and likeness, and secondly, the directive which was taught and lived out in the early and Byzantine churches that we should love and serve our fellow human beings, especially in times of epidemic, war, or other crises. So to begin with the Christian belief that we were created according to God's image and likeness, you'll all be aware, I'm sure, of the basis for this idea in the creation story that culminates in God's fashioning of humanity in Genesis 1:26. The Cappadocian Fathers, John Chrysostom and other early Christian teachers, stressed the nobility of humanity, free choice, and the capacity to develop the virtues because we are images, ikones, of God. The divine likeness for most of the fathers is something into which we can grow during the process of deification that begins with Christian baptism. This optimistic view of every human person, and I should add that the potential is there whether we're baptized as Christians or not, should permeate the policies of every modern society. Unfortunately, although many of us live in states such as Britain that profess to be Christian, we don't always see the concern and care for humanity that should be present. I was disturbed at the beginning of March or so, when the virus was just beginning to spread throughout our country, by the government's use of the term herd immunity. It has to be said that this terminology was fairly quickly abandoned, as our leaders, along with their scientific advisors, came round to the view that quarantine and protection, especially for the sake of our most vulnerable citizens, was the better way forward. However, the initial response did suggest, in a most unfortunate way, that the best way to get through this crisis with a minimum of economic damage would be to allow a certain number of people to be infected and possibly die with the virus. A second worrying trend, and again I can only speak from my experience in England, was the treatment of care homes for the elderly. Not only was there an initial policy to return older patients from hospitals to care homes in order to free up beds without first testing them for the coronavirus, but we're now learning that some homes were instructed not to call doctors or send elderly patients to hospital if they became ill with the virus. As more evidence about these early weeks begins to emerge, and yes, many of these policies are now being changed, it's difficult not to feel that our society has failed, at least in this instance, our most vulnerable citizens. This is an issue on which the churches, including our Orthodox jurisdictions, could speak out more than they have so far been doing. We need to defend our belief that every human being is an image of God, deserving respect, care, and love. And I'd like above all to see bishops writing to politicians about this issue. However, the lower clergy and lay people could also be speaking out. Secondly, I wanted to say something about the Christian imperative to serve and care for the sick, the poor, and the homeless in our society. There's ample evidence that the early Christian and Byzantine churches took this seriously and acted on it. Although such care may have been provided in less structured ways during the earliest period, it was institutionalized under the Christian Roman emperors. We think, for example, of the work of the Cappadocian Fathers, especially St. Basil the Great, in founding charitable houses of all kinds. From the reign of Constantine onwards, but especially under the 6th century Emperor Justinian, Constantinople was furnished with hostels for the poor and for migrants or foreigners, hospitals, orphanages, and other welfare institutions. Most cities and towns within the Eastern Roman Empire would also have possessed such facilities. In the earlier centuries, the responsibility for running them lay with bishops. Later, this was sometimes taken on by emperors or imperial monastic foundations, such as the Pantokrator monastery in Constantinople. But the point here, I think, is that Byzantine Christians understood Christ's commandments and indeed his personal example in looking after the ill and the poor. As for patristic or Byzantine responses to epidemic or plague in particular, there are many examples of recognition that such events call for benevolent responses from the state, the church, and all lay Christians. One of the most famous examples, which has been cited quite a lot recently, is Saint Cyprian of Carthage's witness to the plague that struck North Africa in the second half of the 3rd century. Cyprian wrote in 2 treatises, including one that's called On Mortality, that epidemics such as the one that he and his fellow citizens were experiencing affect all people, rich and poor, righteous and sinners, Christians and non-Christians. While Christians have no special defense against illness, they do have hope in the final resurrection. But Cyprian says that those who are still alive should feel empathy with all sufferers and should do their utmost to help the ill and those who are impoverished as a result of the plague. Our modern Orthodox churches are sometimes described as being too vertical. That is, we focus on our relationship with God, and sometimes that's in a rather individualistic way, as opposed to working on the horizontal or human dimensions of our faith and life. It seems to me that the current situation, which the previous speakers have spoken so eloquently about as an apocalypse, a crisis, it's also an opportunity. It offers us the opportunity to redress this balance. And it's not simply an opportunity for our clergy, led by the bishops, to redistribute church funds or provide in some way for those who are sick or destitute. It's something that all of us as lay Christians can involve ourselves in. Such involvement can be done in the context of our parishes, and I know that many Orthodox parishes are organizing themselves to help weaker members of their communities. But it also can help in the context of our local communities. Most towns and cities in England have created groups of volunteers who help to collect groceries or prescriptions, or for those who are unable to go out themselves, simply to ring members of the community who are isolated and lonely. I believe that we can rise to this challenge using our historical tradition as inspiration and grow in the process. So a time of crisis may also be a time of opportunity for spiritual and personal growth in our Christian way of life. Thank you.